For most of us, the most common photograph we're dealing with are usually pictures of people, whether it's friends or family or kids. We tend to accumulate a lot of these photos, and in working with these photos, we approach them a little bit differently than we do with landscapes or scenic images. Whereas with the landscapes and the scenics, we're looking for contrast, color saturation, and a little bit of punch to the image. In the case of people, we're primarily concerned with skin tone. Does the skin look like a natural color? Are we minimizing blemishes or other artifacts on the skin? We look at the eyes. Are the eyes open? Are they clear? Are they light enough to still hold some detail? You want to be careful of, sometimes you get something called red eye when you use a flash in a dark environment. So all these things are important in terms of creating a pleasing portrait or people photo. This is a pretty typical vacation photo of three women sitting under a tree. And you can see a couple of issues. We've got a lot of contrast going on. We have a very bright area on the ground here and in the background, and then where the women are seated, it's in the shade. And so their faces are kind of dark, the hair is blocked up, and we're not seeing a whole lot of detail. This is a pretty common problem. A camera will look at this and it'll automatically meter the scene, and it tries to average out all the lights and darks. And so when you have a lot of contrast, it's difficult to make either one really read well. So we'll start looking at our blacks, the deepest tones in the image. And you can see already we have a little blue highlight here and down over here showing us that the blacks are already starting to get blocked up. And you can see it on the histogram all the way on the left-hand side where you have this spike going up along the left border there. So the blacks we can open up a little bit. We can bring it up to the right, even as much as, let's say, plus 20. It still reads as black, so I'm not worried about making it too washed out. And the whites, that's going to be our extreme right side, our brightest lights in the photo. I can bring that up a little bit, but you can see it starts to blow out the background. Now, I'm not all that concerned about the background, but I still don't want blown out bright white areas. So let's just leave it at about a plus 10. That's really enough, and we'll deal with the other contrast issues as we get more into this. So now the shadow slider is going to be the next set of dark tones, not quite as dark as the blacks that we dealt with. And this is the prime area of interest of where the women are seated, and most of their value, you can see in the histogram, most of the values are in the area of shadows. So we need to open those up a little bit. So if we move the shadow slider to the right, you can see it really begins to open up the tones in the women and their clothing and their skin, and they really look a whole lot better, and we can see much more detail of what's going on. You can see the hair, we've got detail, it's not just black anymore. So we can go even with a pretty extreme value of here, I've got about a 70 or 71, and that really looks a lot better. And our skin tones are still okay. They haven't gotten any strange color casts or anything like that. They're a little reddish, which we want, that looks healthy, so I think we're okay. So the next slider we can work on is the highlights. And the highlights are the light areas, not quite as bright as the whites that we worked with before. And maybe bringing those down, you can see what happens to the ground with the gravel around their feet. It starts to become more in line with the shadow area. It's not so extreme from light to dark. It's a much closer relationship now when we bring these highlights down, and it just makes the whole image a lot more pleasing. So then the contrast, like we did before, we're not going to adjust that because by doing all these other things, we are adjusting the contrast. So there's no point in doing it twice. And exposure is going to be our middle values. That's on the histogram, you can see it's right in the center area. And so we can open those up a little bit, and it adds a little brightness, and it really helps to just lighten the feel of the image and bringing detail to the faces and just making them look better. Next, we can look at the color temperature of the photo. And as shot, you can see it says it's 5,250 degrees and the tint is a -1. Since the person in the center here is wearing a gray blouse or a gray shirt, we can use that as a sample point for a medium gray or for a middle gray value to set the rest of the images. So rest of the tones in the image. So if I put the eyedropper over the gray part of her sweater here and click it, we can see that the tones now move to 5750. The color temperature moved to 5750, which means it added a little bit of yellow to the image. And you can see that a little bit. It's pretty subtle, and the tint moved to -3. So you can see if we move the temperature to the left, it gets really blue. If I move it to the right, it gets really yellow. So going back to the 5750 that we did from sampling, you can see it looks pretty natural. You have to be careful looking at images like this for a long time because your eye gets used to seeing it and you don't perceive the changes, especially something very subtle in terms of the blue versus the yellow in the color temperature. So it may take a little bit of experimenting and going back and forth to see what works. We can stay with this, the sample. I think maybe it's got a little too much yellow. It can go a little bit back towards the blue, just a hair, but that seems to look pretty good. And again, we can always go back and adjust these things later if we need to. So looking at the dehaze, clarity, and texture filters, first, the texture, we don't want to do too much with that because that's going to add a lot of contrast to our areas of transition from light to dark. And we don't want to make that too extreme. You can see I brought it all the way to the right, and the whole feel of the photo is just very harsh and very contrasty, and it just doesn't work. There's a reason why people use soft filters on camera sometimes for portraits, because people generally look better when you soften the features and soften the defects or blemishes on people's skin. So the texture, we can move it up just a hair, just maybe 3, just to get a little more definition in the water behind them. The clarity is going to be less harsh in terms of these areas of transition because the clarity is going to work more on the areas of transition of tone from dark to light that are larger, where the transition is much more gradual. So bringing that all the way up, it still adds a lot of contrast, not quite as severe as we saw with the texture slider, but certainly too much. So bringing it back down, well, you can look at what happens when you go all the way to the left. It gets really soft and kind of weird looking. So if we bring it up just a little bit, it can add a little bit of punch to the image, but again, we don't want too much. We're just looking for pretty subtle approach here in terms of how we're going to deal with color and contrast. So I left that at a +8. Now looking at the dehaze filter, we do probably have some haze in the background, although I don't really care too much about it because it's the background and the main interest of the photo here are the 3 people in the middle. So the dehaze we can leave as is. You can see what it does if I bring it all the way to the right. It adds a lot of crazy contrast, which doesn't work. Bringing it all the way to the left brings a lot of haze, which equally doesn't really work well. For some portraits, if you're doing just a close-up of a person's face or something like that, sometimes adding a negative dehaze filter could make the skin look nicer and smoother. So it's something to definitely experiment with. But in this case, we're going to leave it at 0. Next, we have vibrance and saturation, which is the color saturation or intensity of the colors here. So vibrance is going to affect more the middle tones and leave the extremes, darks and lights alone. If I bring it all the way to the right, you can see we get some really bizarre color going on that looks very unnatural. So we can bring it up a little bit just to add a little color punch, being that the girls are wearing red and blue. There is some color that takes place, but again, we want to be careful of skin tones. We don't want to introduce weird color casts into the skin. We don't want it to be too red or too yellow or too blue or anything. We just want the skin to look natural. So we're going to leave the vibrance at about a +4, +5. That seems to work okay. Saturation, again, you can see the same thing. The colors get really strange, and if we bring it all the way down, it turns it into a black and white. I'm going to leave the saturation at 0. We don't really need it. Again, we're concerned about skin tone and how the people look, and they look pretty nice here. I don't want to make them have real saturated colors in their skin. So now what we can do is we can look at how do the figures fit into the overall background, how is the shot look in composition in total. So you can see with the figure right here in the center in the front of the tree, there's a bright highlight on her leg and on her shoe, which could be a little distracting. And also the ground around the shadow, around the shade area here is very bright in relation to the three figures here. So let's create a mask. I'm going to create a linear gradient that goes from the bottom up and partially up their legs. And I'm going to lower the exposure a little bit and lower the whites, the extreme brights, the extreme white in this area. And you can see our red warning area has disappeared, and we're bringing some tone back into the gravel. And it's not, what it does is it more equalizes the contrast between the sunlit area and the shade area. So it's certainly a lot more pleasing. So we brought the whites down to a -39. And we could do something similar on the top of the image where we could create a little more dark area to guide the eye of the viewer to the people in the center of the image. So we could let this go a little bit dark, not too much. And you can see that does help. It brings a little more, deep color into the overall image and guides your eye more to the faces and to the three people. Looking at before and after, that's what we started with, where we had very deep shadows in the shade of the tree and very bright in the sunlit. And now if we look at what we've got, we've opened up all the color and detail in the figures, and it's certainly a lot more pleasing. The last thing to look at is our composition. We've got this large red thing here, which is a little distracting, and the rocks in the water over here. Now, in a vacation photo, it can be important to give a sense of place. You want to remember where the photo was taken, and anything that can give us a clue to that could be important. In this case, my intention is I want to eliminate some of these things. So if we go to our composition, you see our rule of thirds is being brought up. And I'm going to go to an aspect ratio of 4:5 or 8:10. And I'm going to make it into a vertical. Even though this shot was shot, the image was shot as a horizontal, there's no reason why we have to stay with that. So looking at our rule of thirds, you can see if I bring it down, you can see the center of the faces are going right through the 1/3 line, which is pretty much exactly where we would want our main point of interest, or even maybe a little bit above that. Because it makes that makes the faces the point. It makes it somewhat asymmetrical and not boring. So the way it is right now, the tree also acts as a nice element in line with the woman on the right side here. Again, along that 1/3 line, we've eliminated the red thing on the right side here, and we've eliminated the rocks on the left. And so if we accept that, you can see we've ended up with a much more pleasing image, and the attention is where it deserves to be, which is on the three people. As you can see, our approach with dealing with photos of people is a little bit different than dealing with photos of landscapes or scenic images. In the case of the photo that we worked on here of the three women, we were concerned with being able to see the details in their faces, make sure the eyes are light enough to see them, that they're not blocked up and totally dark. We want the skin tones to read as natural as possible. And the other elements in the photo are really secondary. The background stuff or elements that are in the background, like in this case, we got rid of that big red thing, which was just a distracting element in the photo. So minimize things in the background, let them go out of focus or just let them fall away, and keep your attention on the people and especially their faces.